South Africa agrees with many of today's speakers.
Pandor echoed calls from others for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza as she lamented the blatant targeting of civilians on both sides of the conflict.
South Africa also joins the urgent calls for an immediate comprehensive ceasefire and that humanitarian corridors should be opened so that aid and other basic services reach all those in need. Most importantly, we call on all parties to exercise restraint and to desist from fueling this patently unjust war and suffering of innocents. Mr. President, we also express condolences to the people of Palestine and of Israel for the lives lost during the past 2 weeks. We are horrified at the blatant targeting of civilians, a clear violation of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention and its protocols. Both Hamas and the State of Israel have committed these violations.
Pandor highlighted that the killing of civilians and the subsequent destruction of infrastructure go against the tenets of international law. And with the war between Israel and Hamas continuing, civilians, particularly those in Gaza, are now bearing the brunt.
There is an added obligation on an occupying power over the people and territory it occupies in terms of the Geneva Conventions, including a prohibition against collective punishment. This, of course, does not detract from South Africa's concern at the actions of Hamas, which also targeted non-combatants. Whilst we express concern at the current violence and deaths, we cannot ignore the fact that continued occupation has bred hatred, suffering, and pain. Just as Israel deserves peace and security, so are Palestinians deserving of sovereignty, peace, and security. It is our view that for international law to be credible, it must be applied uniformly and not be selective.
South Africa's chief diplomat also voiced additional concern at the Council's inability to meet the moment.
History cannot keep repeating such cruelty with all of us watching. We should establish a system of global governance that is fair, equitable, and has the capacity to respond to the needs of all persons in situations of threat and harm.
Mr. Secretary General, in what world do you live?
Earlier, the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen cancelled a meeting with the Secretary General over his comments that the Hamas attack did not happen in a vacuum, while the Israeli ambassador called for the UN chief Antonio Guterres to resign.
When you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism. Hamas, as the minister explained, beheaded babies, burned families, raped women, abducted kids, babies, Holocaust survivors. And the SG is blaming the victim? You are blaming Israel? This is a pure blood libel. This is a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign.
All this as a US-drafted resolution calling for humanitarian pauses appears increasingly imperiled after Russia signaled it could not support the text because it didn't call for an immediate ceasefire.
We're convinced that the key point here is the need for a swift ceasefire. The fact that it was not included in the Council project was a step in the wrong direction and could be interpreted as Council support for Israel's plans to conduct a ground offensive in Gaza.
Russia has signaled it would introduce a separate draft calling for that humanitarian ceasefire. And while diplomacy stumbles from pillar to post in New York, little reprieve for civilians caught in what the SG has described as a god-awful nightmare. 28 trucks due to enter Gaza via the Rafah border crossing with Egypt did not do so as expected on Tuesday, with a UN spokesperson expressing hope that those trucks will make it across on Wednesday. Only 54 trucks have made it into the enclave since Saturday. The UN says they need at least 100 trucks per day to meet the needs on the ground, while no fuel has entered the enclave since aid deliveries began trickling in, leaving much of the region without power and in darkness. Sherwin Brycepease, SABC News, New York.